Okay, it's time. Thank you very much for attending this talk. I'm very excited with this big crowd, okay? So I have some live freshmen here, and I still have some in my office. So if they run out, I can just supply more, okay? Don't worry, just take whatever you want. Okay, so this is the first spring series of the Common Colloquium. So this is the first one. We have 3 altogether. And today we are very honored to have the best in our department, Dr. Forgash and Robin Kisa. Okay, so they're going to be here to do a presentation of their fieldwork during the spring break, right?
More than that.
More than that.
I've been there for 30 years.
Yeah,
Okay.
35. Fieldwork of 35 years. It's no in this PowerPoint. Okay, now I'm just going to leave let the room to them, and then just let's hear it. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, the title of our project is the Chorti project. And you notice I'm not pronouncing the ch of Chorti because they don't either, so don't worry about it. They write it like this, however. And it's research, which I'm going to mainly talk about, practice, which the students are going to talk about, and community, which Rebecca's mostly going to talk about. Initially, the project was set up to do language revitalization of Chorti in eastern Guatemala. There are about 46,000 Chorti people living there and 4,200 in Honduras. The ones in Honduras don't speak Chorti. And only 15,000 in that number shifts depending on who you talk to, mostly in and around the town of Pocotan. I worked with them way back in the 70s, and I wrote my dissertation on Chorti and actually on a lot of my languages. It was a comparative study. And I wrote a few articles while I was working here at Metro, but the Metro schedule is pretty heavy, and I wasn't able to do any research after that, and didn't do any till I retired, which I'm retired now, so I have a lot of time. I can do whatever I want. And I want to work with the Chorti to revitalize the language. They need educational materials for their bilingual schools, and they have some bilingual teachers who actually can speak Chorti. Most of them have a kind of passive knowledge of Chorti, and all of them know the alphabet, and that's about all they teach in the bilingual programs. So what we wanted to do was give them some things to read. And I found in my basement some old texts. I found them, it's on a microfilm that I bought from Chicago about 30 years ago of Wisdom, who did texts in the 1930s. And he's never published this stuff, but I have it on, I've scanned it now so the students can work with it. And I also have Thought's text, who he published 40 stories in here, and he's told me he has a lot more, but I haven't seen them. And he told me also that his memory wasn't very good, and so I haven't really heard from him in a while. So I don't know whether we're ever going to see those. Anyway, Rebecca offered her help for the digitization of these texts, and the ethnography lab has been working to digitize them, and then I clean them up according to the writing system. Here's an example of the wisdom texts that I found on microfilm. They were written in pencil with a lot of erasures and cross-outs, and if you're trying to write a story, it takes a lot of effort. Your stories can't be very complicated usually. And his stories were simple, and he didn't do a lot of them. There are 181 pages of that, and there's a lot of repetition because he was trying to do a better job. Oh, by the way, whoops, I turned it off. Oh dear. Oh. I wanted to say that he wrote phonetically, but it's not the modern system. So if you've taken, any class that does phonetics, it doesn't show. I mean, it's a different system. Then there's Thought, who has a more readable system to our mind, but it still isn't the phonetic system that we know. And he had at least, his stories are much more interesting because he had a tape recorder and the speaker could do it naturally. And actually, a lot of these symbols in here, press the wrong button. A lot of these symbols in here, like the dashes and the commas and the pluses, are different kinds of pauses and things. And if you're a phonetician, you could really study it, but I never tried it myself. But anyway, he has a very exact phonetic system, and when we got these texts, this is what the system, or the Chorti project arose out of. So, here's a map of Hocotan, and it's in Guatemala, in eastern Guatemala, on the Honduras border, and the Chorti live in an area that looks like that, but the speakers are basically here. So well, I wanted to show you this. Sorry, I should have practiced using this. I don't know how to use it without messing up. Anyway, there's a little town in here called Hocotan, and that's the one we're going to look at. But there are other towns that also speak, where they speak Chorti in slightly different dialects. Okay, here's the Maya family tree, and it's one of the best studied language families in the Americas. Here's where Chorti fits in. It's part of the Cholan branch of languages. This is Eastern Cholan with Chontal and Chol, which are spoken in Mexico. And then Chorti, Eastern Guatemala, and Cholti, which is extinct. There are two significant controversies surrounding this Cholan branch, or actually surrounding the hieroglyphs and that we're kind of exploring in our research here, especially me. This is a map of the languages in the area, and this is where the Spanish discovered that the Maya had codices. They were writing on bark cloth, and they were writing in hieroglyphs, and Yucatec was the language that they were speaking, and that was originally what it was thought that the hieroglyphs were written in. And it's true that they were writing Yucatec using the hieroglyphs, but the theory has changed a little bit, or actually a lot. It shifted to the Cholan languages. Notice Chontal is here, Chol is there, and Chorti is here. And if you look at the area they might cover as a single language, it covers quite a huge area. And most of Pigford think that this area, which is classic Maya, were the languages behind the hieroglyphs. But there's a further controversy that's shifting it from the western branch of languages to the eastern branch of languages. And at least Copan and maybe some of these areas, it was written in Chorti. So the controversy started with Yucatec being the language of the hieroglyphs. And actually, if you go to the Denver Museum or the museum in Copan, all the language of the narrative says, they show you the glyph, they give you the Yucatec translation of the glyph. And a lot of times the translation is similar to the Chorti one, but it isn't always. And now they're starting to say that Cholan was behind the classic glyphs and Yucatec was behind the post-classic glyphs. Okay, if I haven't made myself clear, you can ask me questions later. That's one of the controversies. So it started with Yucatec, then Cholan, and then Chorti. There's been a lot of focus recently on the Chorti area. Glottoclinology suggests that this was Chontal, Chol, and Chorti was one language during the classic Maya period. But there's some reason to believe that glottoclinology is not very useful in this case, because there's been a lot of language contact, and we know that language contact means that there's change in glottoclinology, and these are shorter time periods as well, so we don't really know how competent that is. Okay, so now let's go to the next slide. This is the other controversy. So the first controversy is it's Cholan or as one language, or is it Chorti, which is the eastern branch? Which one was the basis of the hieroglyphs? The other controversy surrounds this whole scenario. This is just the Cholan branch, and it's always been thought that Eastern Cholan had two languages, Chorti, which exists today, and Cholti, which existed alongside it, but got extinct in the 17th century, or a little bit later. But the new theory is that Chorti is a descendant from Cholti, and you could see that in the name. The L did change to R, and there, you can see how that happened. But there's some other reasonable arguments that Cholti was the ancestor. So what that says is there was a single language coming down here, not two languages. This died out, but it didn't really die out because it just went on and on in speakers who live today. So that's the other controversy that exists. But the implications of this is that if Eastern Cholan is the language of the hieroglyphs, then Chorti reasonably that would be the one that was the basis. Okay? So those two controversies are still raging. And my research, basically, the epigraphers and the people who are looking at the hieroglyphs are looking from the hieroglyphs downward at all the Cholan languages and trying to find, correspondences. And I'm working from the Chorti going backward, reconstructing in the other direction, and hopefully we'll meet somehow, or not meet. If we don't meet, then all of this is hogwash. If we do, well, that's good, all right? So that's my research. Now, let me just give you a little background. This is we're talking about the classic Maya in this time period. This is where the hieroglyphs under discussion are, in the controversy. This is the ones where this is the period where the Yucatec speakers clearly were using hieroglyphs. And this is a site, this is Tikal from the classic site, this is one of them. And this is Copan, the one that's near, this is also a classic site near where the Chorti actually live. This is Chichen Itza, which is in the Yucatan, and it's a post-classic site. And here, this is Tulum. Have you been to anybody been to any of these sites? Yeah, one or two, yeah. Okay, so those are in the Yucatec, the latter two. So here's a map showing, here's the classic Maya area, and let's see if I can see, Tikal is here, Copan is here, this is near Hocotan, where we're working, and Palenque's over here. So these are classic Mayan sites, and the hieroglyphs were used all in that area. Hieroglyphs were here too, but this is post-classic, and this is Chichen Itza that I showed you, and Tulum, I showed you. Okay. So the accomplishments of the classic period, they were a network of independent city-states, major capitals, Tikal, Palenque in Mexico, and Copan in Honduras, each ruled by a single family or dynasty, monumental architecture, standardized writing systems with glyphs, scientific and artistic pursuits. They had the concept of a zero, which is apparently very difficult. The calendar, I'm sure you've heard about the Mayan calendar and the end of the world and all that stuff. And the astronomy was really good. They really understood the stars and stuff. And they also had the peasants practicing intensive agriculture. The post-classic period was up in this area. And this is where the classic was down here, and it pushed north so that when the Spanish came and burned the codices, except for a few, the Dresden coda still exists, and there may be some others. But mostly they destroyed them. And this is where the Spanish found some sites. And here's some examples of Mayan writing. This is the most common kind, written on, just carved into stone. And this is what the cloth bark books look like. And that you find a lot of hieroglyphs on pots and things as well. Reading Mayan glyphs is kind of interesting. I'm going to only show you, I'm not showing you the numbers and all that, but anybody who studied any linguistics will understand that, for instance, here you have what's called a lexigram, where this looks like a jaguar and it stands for a jaguar, and then it's pronounced as a jaguar, balam, okay? Here, and the scribe, any particular scribe could use all of these methods. And this one, this is a ba, so this particular one is a syllabary kind of sound where it stands for a syllable. So this little thing stands for ba, and this is like this, so that means Balaam. Or you could have Balaam with the jaguar here, and then the ma down here, so it's sort of phonetic. And then you can have Balaam, the ba, and then the jaguar symbol and the ma. So this has phonetic on both ends. Or you can have the whole thing not look like a jaguar at all. Ba-la-ma, Balaam. So that's typical of how the scribes wrote. Some other ideas about the glyphs, they're found throughout the Maya area during the Classic period. Scribes probably used the language spoken by elites and members of the royal families, and commoners may have spoken different languages. We don't know what those were. So what languages were used to write the ancient Mayan glyphs? Well, what was I going to say with that one? I don't think I was going to say much of anything, except I think I was. Hold on. Yeah. Okay, so it's clearly a Cholan language and not Yucatec, which is what's being represented in the museums. The controversies are still raging. It has not been resolved, but it may be coming to a head. Epigraphers are thinking that Chorti may be one of the languages. It may be one of the languages, or it may be the only language. So there's a certain amount of significance in preserving the Chorti language, not just for the self-identity of the people, which is clearly a good reason, although they tend to push in the other direction because they think they got to live in the modern world and learn Spanish. But it's sometimes easier to persuade people if they have more than just their self-identity, if you can say that this is important to the world, okay? And we can say, I think, that this is important to the world. Okay, so the next glyph is the names of all the people who worked with the project. There's me, and then there's Rebecca. Oops, sorry. Not doing
That's
it right.
not me.
That's somebody else you'll hear about in a sec. This is Rebecca, and Matt, say his last name. Walter. Jenny Phelps, Aaron Nelson, Margot Anthony's here. She's going to say something later. Elizabeth Phelan, Sam couldn't come because he had his teeth taken out today. Jeremy Bongers, where are you? There. And Catherine Aki, and Isaac Nobles. Did Isaac?
He's coming.
He's coming. Okay. Okay, but these are all the people. This guy is Brent Metz from the University of Kansas, and he's been collaborating with us, even though he doesn't know that it's the Chorti project he's collaborating on. However, Metro gave me 5 laptops to give to the Chorti. Randy Wicker, if you know him, he actually gave them to me, and I couldn't carry all 5 of them down, so I asked Brent to carry 2 of them down for me, and this is a picture of him doing that, donating the laptops to the Language Academy that's down there. He's also the founder of the idea of the museum and the tourism project, and which Rebecca hopes to latch on to. He's also interested in planned development in Hocotan. He also hopes to do field schools that perhaps our students can participate in as well, his field schools to Hocotan. And he and I have organized, it's kind of exploded a little bit. We wanted to do a panel in the Triple meetings in the fall, and so he wrote to 20 people and said, you know, we'd like to do something about the Chorti, and 16 people responded, and the panels are only, I don't know, 6 or 7 people. So we have a really strong linguistic panel that has epigraphers and linguists on it. We have perhaps 2 other panels that will be archaeology one and ethnography another. Hopefully all 3 of them will work. We'll see. Anyway, he's helping us a lot. And these are the projects we're doing. Educational materials I've talked about, the museum. They're already starting to build in Hocotan a museum. At least they've got the floor plan. And And we're working on an electronic research library, so researchers can go down there and work on whatever they want to work on. We want to cover the Mayan area. Tourism, and there are a couple of Chorti teachers who want to start a real bilingual school where actually you teach both languages all the way along. There's a field school for students I talked about. We're doing some data collection. At this point, it's mostly an electronic research library. And I talked about the AAA panel and the donation of laptops. And at this point, we want to have the students start to present. So Marco.
Hi, I'm Margot Anthony, and I worked on this project last spring. I'm a senior in the Linguistics department at Metro. And we had basically two, I guess it's ongoing, big categories of things. The first one's the cleanup. So you saw the wisdom text that was all handwritten and the font text that looks like, let's see, pointer code on this page here. And they were both, of course, only hard copy and written before the Chorti had an official written language. Is that
Yes.
true? So they were in no condition for any human person who hadn't written them to read. So our first job was to go through and take out all the funny little pluses and dashes and weird numbers and quotation marks, and then replace the letters that did not exist in the Chorti alphabet with the correct ones. And then we would get this kind of looking thing, and I don't know how well you can see it, but none of us actually speaks Chorti, so at this point it was email it to Dr. Quizar so that she could put in the right spaces. You'll see this has a displaced N that got tacked onto the next word. And she also put in the English gloss. And this third page here is what you guys are using to give the stories to the Chorti so that they had them to read. And so that was our first big thing. And then once we had these texts that we could actually do things with, we were looking at cataloging frequency of certain kinds of words and grammatical structures so that we could see possible examples of language change, because the wisdom text, as you saw earlier, is 30 years older than the font text. And so the ones that I did the most of was, down here, we've got serial verbs, which is a strategy of listing several verbs in a row that have no grammatical indication of their relationship. So that would be I am walking, bringing, carrying the casserole to the potluck, which sounds very strange in English, but is totally appropriate in Chorti. And in conjunction with finding these serial verbs, I was looking at this subordinator, twat, because it's related. If you have the subordinator, you don't necessarily have as many serial verbs, at least that's the idea. And indeed, the twat subordinator is 3 times more common in the more recent text than in the old one, although I wasn't on the project long enough to find out how the verbs actually related to it. And then here, this tia word is somewhere that we can see Spanish influencing the Chorti language, because in the older texts it means either when or no, not when. Yeah, when or where. And then in the newer texts, the Chorti adopted Spanish cuando in a bunch of different forms, so that the tia almost exclusively means where in the font text as opposed to the older wisdom text. And so we're making concrete numerical data about this, so there's a nice spreadsheet that we're just putting the counts into so that there's real data to back up any kind of assertion that Dr. Quizar wants to make about that. And now I'm going to pass the floor to Jeremy.
I'm just going to see here. I don't really have any slides. My name is Jared Rogers. I am a recent current intern with the Chorti project. I just started this semester. I'm also in it with a linguistic focus, I guess you could say. My work with the project has been solely searching through the texts, the finished project, the finished text, final text that they've been giving to the Chorti in Guatemala, looking for subordinators. All of the subordinators, which the ones that we've been looking for are chi, shet, ke, tin, toi, and tia. I think that's all of them. Yeah. And with the primary goal of finding frequency of usage over time between wisdom and thought. And I guess that's really all that I've done really so far at this point. So yeah, that's it.
This is the talking stick. Okay. I don't have any slides, unfortunately. My name is Catherine Akey. I am a senior as well in the Linguistics department. I just joined the internship this semester as well, and have been doing basically the same thing Jeremy has been doing and looking for the support leaders. And I have unfortunately not been able to do as much time lately. So really, one I really worked on is tin. So yeah.
What does it mean?
Oh, tin. Well, there's several different meanings that it seemed to come under. Tin was some, and then like Jeremy also wrote a bunch of them down as well. Those who, some, those that, whoever, how many, someone, which I, one who, those whom, some of, some who, some people, they, whose. I could keep going. There's a lot of them. So, yeah, it's very broad. And so it'll be very interesting to see how they start to disappear from the wisdom text to the top. So it'll be interesting to start working on thought.
Thank you. Okay. So what the students have been working on primarily is kind of the linguistic research side of things. And the research project that originally Robin was working on had to do with language change, simplification due to the influence of Spanish. But this entire project has blossomed into something huge and unwieldy that has opened up a lot of exciting opportunities and possibilities for collaboration across institutions and across subdisciplines within anthropology, across disciplines between anthropology and linguistics, etc. Perhaps even art. It's really interesting. So I'm going to present the travelogue portion of the talk. I was very fortunate to be able to go with Robin to Hoboken in October last semester. And I had a number of goals for my part. I really wanted to familiarize myself with the town, first of all, and try and get a sense of who it is that we're working with in Hoboken, because the purpose here was not just collaboration, but for us to really provide support for local efforts at revitalizing the language and the culture. So the local organizations and individuals who have really spearheaded this effort are people that we're working for, I think. So my first goal was to familiarize myself with the town. I have an interest in how tourism works socially and culturally within communities and the kinds of impact that it has. So my second goal was to survey existing efforts to advertise and document and preserve and revitalize the language, including tourism-related efforts. And then thirdly, to establish relationships with those local organizations that Robin's been working with and individuals who've been working on these projects, And then finally, to attend a workshop that Robin had organized, where she planned to present the text that our students had been working on to the local academia and to the teachers. And so I was really interested to be able to be a part of that. So this is the view out of our hotel when we arrived in Hocotan. It looks gorgeous, right? I mean, the green, it was right at the tail end of the rainy season. I hear it's not usually this green. Robin kept telling me, it's ugly. It's the ugly part of Guatemala. If you want to come and work here, I want you to come, but no. And this is what I saw. I thought she was lying to me. So Hocotan is located, again, in the far eastern section of the Chiquimula department in eastern Guatemala. It's an area of Guatemala that sees very few tourists. Most of the tourists tend to head from Guatemala City straight west into the highlands area. That is where you see the pictures of the women dressed in their very colorful traditional traje, and that's where a lot of the products that you see here in the States come from. This part of Guatemala is not on the tourist beaten path at all. The town and the surrounding hillside villages have a population of around 50,000 residents. About 60% of them are indigenous Chorti. And about 5,000 people, I've heard about 80% of whom are Chorti. 5,000 people live in the town center itself. This is a very small town. I'll show you some pictures, another picture outside of our hotel room. The one hotel in town is over here on the left. We heard about a second hotel, but we weren't able to find evidence of occupation.
Couldn't find the front door.
The hotel has about a dozen rooms, maybe. They've just gotten air conditioning.
3 or 4 rooms.
Oh, in 3 of the rooms, there are air conditioning. They have a small restaurant. There are about 3 other restaurants in town that are open sporadically. So people ask about possibilities for field schools here, and I'm not convinced that the infrastructure is there to support a bunch of American students without them running ramrod over the town yet. However, Dr. Metz at University of Kansas has taken students there. I think they were mostly based in Copan, just over the border in the past, and he will be taking students again. He's planning on doing that next January 2016. So if anyone's interested in an ethnographic field school in that area, he's your person. He has published several books on the Chorti. He's done an ethnography that was published in 2006. And then he has an edited volume that is interdisciplinary, 4-field anthropology plus linguists, that resulted from a previous set of conference panels that brought people together to look at this issue of, is the Chorti the language that was used to write the glyphs, in addition to really just bringing Chorti-focused people together. I have a copy of this in my office if anybody wants to borrow it. I think there's going to be another book forthcoming from these panels at the AAA this coming March. That's my hunch.
He claimed no, but
He claimed no, but this one's 2009, so it's due for an update. They have a lovely colonial church. The church was really quite special. We were there on a Sunday. It was a market day. People were hanging out in front of the church, no movie theaters or anything like that. People had come down from the hillside communities called the aldeas to come down into the town and spend time with each other. We walked through the market. I just went to do a quick walking tour of the Hocotan. I didn't try them, but they looked amazing. I think it's cabbage. Yeah. It's a typical market. There's you can see right here a woman with a traditional traje on. This is the traditional dress. I don't know how traditional it is or whether it's an invented tradition, to tell you quite truthfully. But we only saw, what, 2 or 3 or 4 people wearing it. So it's not an area where where people embrace those kinds of physical markers of indigeneity very readily. There was quite a lot of discrimination. It was often not in one's best interest to appear indigenous during the Civil War period, in Guatemala especially, and so this is an area where people went underground with their indigenous identities. They stopped wearing the dress. Many of them stopped speaking the language as a result.
When was that?
The 80s,
Well, yeah, in the 80s, 70s and 80s.
It ended in 96.
96.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this one, peace treaty was.
They're still afraid to admit that they speak Chorti, and their neighbors will tell you, of course they speak Chorti. To me, they speak Chorti, but they don't tell outsiders that because it's scary. But it still is.
Okay, so on our first full day in town, Robin ran a workshop on the Chorti language. It was, I believe, organized or sponsored by the Academy de las Lenguas Mayas. But Robin also invited representatives from several other literacy organizations in town. And for me as a cultural anthropologist, looking at how these different groups interacted with one another, Robin had warned me that there's a lack of trust between some of these factions in town who seem to be all working towards the same set of goals, but representing different, perhaps different ethnic groups and backgrounds, different political stances, etc. So this started out early in the morning. There were 5 people that showed up. And we were, still heartened. This is good. There are people who are going to be able to use the texts that students have been working on. But within an hour, people started to stream in. There was a whole group of university students, I think, who were teachers ed students who came in. And ended up being between 50 and 60 attendees for the workshop in this very small town. So it was very, very well attended. She also invited individuals who had been working on the museum idea with Dr. Metz. And so this was an opportunity to bridge the literacy efforts with the other kinds of heritage preservation efforts that were going on in town. At the workshop, she shared the transliterated thought texts that our students had been working on, and she also solicited feedback and suggestions for how to further revise those texts so that they would be more accessible to local people. And so here she broke everybody into groups and had them work with particular texts. What can we do differently with the writing system? How can we make this more useful? What formatting, et cetera, within the schools or in other venues where they would be teaching Chorti. And I want to share with you one of the texts that she, one of the texts that, somebody's listening.
How many did you make?
I don't know, I made like 35. I might have enough for everybody. One of the things that she did with these texts when she presented them was to ask people to read them out loud in Chorti. And many of these stories had been, there were the grandparents who had relayed these stories. And perhaps they had heard the stories before, spoken orally, but they certainly hadn't seen them in print before. And it was really moving for me to see the emotion that some of the speakers had when they were reading the texts. Other speakers, you could very clearly tell that they didn't speak Chorti. They were Chorti ethnically, but didn't speak the language, and so they were, word by word, working very arduously through the text as well. And everybody else was laughing at them. I mean, it was just this really kind of a warm, really wonderful kind of opportunity for people to connect with the language. And this is a great story, I think. It's my favorite, well, no, it's not my favorite, but some of the other stories are not appropriate to share now. This one is The Toad and the Hawk, and it's a great story about the toad who thinks he's outsmarted the hawk. The hawk's going to go hang out in the clouds in the sky, and the toad wants to go with him, but he can't fly, and so he sneaks into the hawk's bag, and the hawk flies him up without realizing it. And when he gets up there, he tries to trick the hawk and say, no, I was here first. And so the hawk, hangs out for a while, and then he heads back down to earth, and the toad's stuck. So what does the toad do? Well, he says, well, I'm going to try and fly too. And he dive bombs out of the cloud, and he slats on the ground, and that's how the toad got his fat belly in this is the English translation. So if you open up, you can see the original plot. And then you can see the transliterated version of the story. This was prepared by Dr. Quizar with help from the students, Margot included, over the last couple of years. It's readable. So I'd like to actually ask Dr. Stewart if he wouldn't mind reading some of the Chorti, because he could probably do the glottal consonants a lot better than I can.
Ayan inte pokonya kawan karena esa pota kawan cek untuk dia iman di nu ishikia tu kata tu kin utakui ba kaka esa.
Very good.
Good.
Yeah, it sounds really good.
Better than a lot of So, I don't, Steve, what languages did you focus on? It wasn't Chorti.
Okay, no, it's like, my focus was on Tekchi, and if you remember when Robin was pointing out the language, where Chorti was, and the languages which were the sister languages of Chorti, and then there were a bunch of languages going down, there was a long list of languages. The very bottom,
The last language was his.
go back a little bit more.
One more, 2 more, 5 more, 6. There, oh, there. There.
There.
This is this one.
Okay, now,
Oh.
that's Tekchi. So it's like as distant from Chol as Russian is from English.
Okay. But you could read this.
Oh, well, the thing is that if you know, this is the official alphabet.
Okay.
And I know what the one thing I did not know is where if all the words were going to end, if the accent was going to fall on the final syllable.
Yeah, it does,
It
does in Chorti too.
No.
That's why it sounded so good.
But then it's more just a matter of knowing how to pronounce, glottalized or imploded stuff like.
Can I say one thing? Steve and I worked on the same project down there, and we used an alphabet that was developed for that project by Terry Kaufman and others. And we taught our students learned how to read that. Our students meaning the speakers of the languages. I worked with Chorti speakers, he worked with Chorti speakers. So they learned how to do that. So when they vote, there was a countrywide vote on which alphabet to use, they chose ours.
Which one is that?
With one exception?
Well, they did not. We used to write a glottal stop with the number 7.
Oh, the number 7,
And
right.
they threw that out.
Yeah, forgot about that. Yeah, we just shifted over to
So, where am I?
Yeah, we
Just a
interrupted.
second.
You're
No, I
doing
really
the hot-
wanted that out because I wanted you to really understand that what the font originally looked like is completely unreadable at this point, but what the students have been working on and have really made a huge impact with is to put these text into the standardized orthography that's used throughout Guatemala to represent Mayan languages now?
Not in Mexico.
Okay. All right, so throughout the country of Guatemala, at least, these texts are in the current standard at this point, which is a huge step. Okay, so I just wanted to cross the border for a second. We did that on our trip in October. There is a Chorti population in Honduras as well. It lives primarily in the Copan and Ocotepeque, is that right? Departments. Currently, they're estimating about 4,200 Chorti living in Honduras. By the mid-20th century, the Honduran Chorti were, probably in Guatemala as well, were regarded simply as traditional Chorti peasants. They had really lost their indigenous identity, at least as far as government recognition was concerned. This was due to assimilation and the near total loss of their language. There are very few speakers of Chorti in Honduras today. In 1994, the villagers, Chorti villagers in Honduras formed the National Council of Indigenous Chorti of Honduras. It's a political group which has done quite a lot of activism, seems to have some influence across the border as well. They joined other Honduran indigenous organizations to demand political rights and the return of indigenous lands. As part of this effort, they acquired funds to reintroduce Mayan language into the area. But rather than teach Chorti, they hired a teacher from Guatemala to teach Quiche. And Quiche is spoken in the highlands of Guatemala. Today there are nearly 800 people in Honduras who speak Quiche. Most of them are young people. There are, it's taught in schools, there are textbooks up to age grade 3, etc., that are approved by the Guatemalan or by the Honduran government. And this history jives what we were told with something that we were told during Robin's workshop when one participant mentioned that he was taught Quiche as a boy in Chiquimula as well, despite the fact that he himself was indigenous Chorti. And this was mentioned, by the way, in the context of a larger discussion about how the Chorti have been marginalized in Copan, both by the government and also by archaeologists conducting research at the archaeological sites. Just a quick look here, you can note the tourism ad that offers Chorti language tours out of Copan today. Of course, they're offering to transport you over the border to Cocotan because they don't have Chorti speakers in Copan itself. And this is not the exact guy that we walked by on the trail with a machete, but it is a guy with a machete. And we have some great stories about our trip as well. I don't know who those people are. In connection with the proposed museum project in Hocotan that Robin mentioned earlier, one of our goals for the October trip was to survey the existing museums at Copan. We wanted to do this to explore how the narratives in the Copan museums might be adapted or integrated into the exhibits in the new Hocotan museum. So among the museums that we visited were the Copan Archaeological Park, the Copan Regional Archaeological Museum in the town of Copan Ruinas, this state-of-the-art Copan Sculptural Museum, which was funded by Harvard Peabody Museum. It was amazing. And there was also a photo exhibit that chronicled the history of archaeology in Copan. It's currently housed in a temporary space in the municipal building in the town. It was presented as a gift from Harvard to the town. And I took copious notes and photographs of the museum exhibits while I was there. One of my future projects I'm hoping is going to involve analyzing how the museums at Copan organize our understandings of the past and the connections or lack of connections to the indigenous peoples who live in the region. Some of the key themes that I've noted already in my notes include the following points. First, there's no mention of Chorti in the museums, any of them at all. No mention of the language of people. Glyph texts are cited to provide information, but there's no discussion of the language used to inscribe them or the linguistic controversies that Robin talked about. There is an emphasis on the probable foreign origins of Kinish Yashkukmo, who was the dynasty founder in Copan, with the suggestion that he came from Teotihuacan in the Central Valley of Mexico. That interpretation has since been revised. As I understand it, I went and did a crash course in strontium isotope analysis over the weekend, and I unearthed a number of recent reports written by the same team from University of Pennsylvania who first came up with this set of the Teotihuacan interpretation in 1999. They have work 10 years later, 2009, that revises that, saying that strontium, you can have a look at, isotope profiles in Mexico do not match the analyses that they did in Copan at all. And so he probably never did go to Copan if they have in fact found the founder. But instead, it's highly probable that he spent much of his life in the Tikal region in Copan. This particular example, I think, I raised this example because I just wanted to highlight how there's an ongoing reinterpretation of the archaeological artifacts at Copan. But the museum itself represents older interpretations. And I also wanted to draw attention to the social and political impact of these museum narratives. For Chorti activists in Honduras and Guatemala, the utter lack of a mention of contemporary Chorti and the possible connections to the classic era Copan is really deeply problematic. I think it's important for us to understand that simply engaging the question of the possibility of those connections or whether they can be proven to be correct or not is validating to local people. And so I think that's what this project aims to do. It's to really engage those questions in ways that haven't been done before, using new data and new analyses and working across subdisciplines. So our work involves trying to bring together scientists and scholars and members of the local community to critically engage those long-standing stereotypes and representations of the Chorti peoples as kind of unassimilated or assimilated non-Mayans with no connection whatsoever to classic era people. So on that note, there are a number of initiatives that Robin spoke of. We do have a student who is planning to go down to Guatemala to Hoboken in June to begin laying the groundwork for future groups of students to go. And I wanted to introduce you to Isaac. He's going to talk a little bit about his plans for the summer.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Isaac Nobles. I'm a senior here at Metro, and I'm an anthro and biology major. And I got involved in this project with Dr. Forgash because last summer I did an independent study in the highlands of Guatemala in which I worked on refining my ethnographic research skills, as well as I emphasized looking at tourism and how it affects indigeneity and the production of indigenous identity and how that can be altered with tourism. And so in this project I'm going down in Hoboken to hopefully meet up with the contacts that we've already developed through Dr. Quizar's contacts, as well as hopefully make contact with Dr. Metz from Kansas and establish connections with his contacts as well. And as Dr. Forgash alluded to, hopefully in some ways bring those connections and contacts together because they do have a lot of similar goals in propagating the indigenous identity. And so while I'm there, I'm hoping to also analyze and propose some future projects that students who go down there in the future might be able to participate in, as well as establishing maybe some infrastructure with the language school and with Dr. Metz's contacts to hopefully provide some more future opportunities for students.
We're hoping to send him to graduate school at Kansas.
Hopefully.
To work with Brent. Thank you. Anything else that you want to say? Sure. Let's close. Okay. So we don't want to keep you out that much longer. And we would like to go ahead and close by thanking people that have had helped us with this project so far and who will continue to hopefully be involved. Does anybody have any discussion or questions or responses or?
I'd just like to know what, who, if any, epigraphers that your project is working with?
Well, for the AAAs, we've invited an epigrapher from, from Spain, and an epigrapher from Amsterdam. He just finished his dissertation, and both of them are really into epigraphy, and they're going to be on the linguistic panel. But we haven't made a lot of connections. John Robertson, who's an epigrapher, he's more of a linguist, but he works with epigraphers closely, is also going to be on that AAA panel. So it's a kind of future thing. Mostly it's been reading and trying to figure things out, but we are connecting with people. So
I was just wondering if you're connecting with people like David Stewart or Martin
not at this point yet. And part of the problem is they have the prejudice that it isn't Chorti. It is a problem.
Actually, they think that it is Chorti.
Oh,
there was an article.
that's very recent then.
There was an article written quite a number of years ago. Stephen
Houston
David
does.
Stewart, and I can't remember the other guy, that were actually analyzing, and it was interesting. You talked about the geographical identification, because they mentioned that in there and how they threw that out. And basically, they were looking at Tolan languages and Chorti as.
Yeah, Robertson and Houston wrote that. Yeah. And Robertson's always been very strong on Chorti, and Houston too. Yeah, that's true. No, we haven't had a lot. Yeah.
Are there any ethno-political organizations in the largest cities that are attempting to help out with this kind of project? I mean, I work in Yucatan, and there's several organizations, one of which is Indian Maya, and they're basically academics who are trying to go out into the rural areas to try to get these kinds of things going. Do you have that kind of support or resource?
Not really.
No.
Not at this time. We want to.
Well, the Academy
Well, we have the, we have local
body.
ones. We have the Language Academy, I'm collaborating directly with them. And we have the Literacy Project that I'm working with.
Yeah.
And they are local. They don't, they can't do a lot of stuff because they don't have enough money to help us a lot, but they were at, for instance, that workshop.
Are they political?
Yeah,
Okay.
everybody's a little bit political.
Because Indian Maya is kind of a thorn in the side of the Mexican government, put it that way. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
the politicians shake their heads whenever Indian Maya shows up anywhere, because it's a part of the broader indigenous rights.
Some of them are more, that Jorge in Alaska about this one is quite radical, and he came to that workshop and he talked.
He works for Montanita in Hokotan, and came and that's partially where the political divisions are between various members of the community. That's a socialist organization in that part of Guatemala, and certainly people have been vocal in the past about, you need to trust, listen, work with these people, but not these people. Robin has been warned off from individuals, including
Jorge is
Yeah.
one of them.
but to have everybody come together to the same table, I think was amazing that day. And to have everybody work together and say their piece and listen to each other was major.
I think you don't have as many governmental organizations in Guatemala either, or NGOs, because of the previous civil war. So there's not as much of a formal or national effort that are indigenous, pro-indigenous.
Also, that, you know, if you look at Guatemala, it's, when I was down there in the 70s, it was over 75% indigenous. And, you know, they wouldn't classify it that way now probably, but it's a huge indigenous population. They're the majority, not the minority.
Yeah, and
So it's
in
different.
the peninsula as well, and it's around
Yeah.
78% up in where I am. My ethnographic board's near Uxmal, and so it's still an extremely high percentage of people, though they haven't had the war history been so recent as they have in Guatemala. Although the Guerra de las Castas, the caste war of the 1800s, some will say that still isn't over in the cultural sense, even though the fighting has stopped, you know.
Just one thing is that there is a museum project of sorts that I know about because Andres Alvarez, who is a head of the anthropology department at Del Valle University, was well versed in this, and he actually came to my class in Mayan peoples and cultures and talked about the museum in another town. And so I would think that he would be a very good resource. And he's, you know, been here, been to Denver, you know. He was temporarily at BU for a period of time. And I would also like to take this opportunity before everyone leaves to say that I am going to teach a class in Mayan linguistics next fall if I get enough students. And I don't have a flyer yet, but one will be coming out, and I'm sure if you're around Metro, you will see it at some point. I would certainly, you know, invite any and all to sign up for this thing. Now, my idea is that I will start by focusing on Tech Chief, and I will give every student a free book. A grammar Tech Chief. But I also I plan to look at the other, a number of the other major languages, and discuss things that are not necessarily, not necessarily a part of Tech Chief. Try to make it as wide ranging as possible. Maybe we can get a little visiting, a lecture or two from Robin, and that would be great, and that would give you a broad idea of what's going on in Mayan linguistics and why it is so well documented.
We'd love to have students then, take the class and then come and work on the project as well. And I just want to mention that there's so much expertise right here at Metro in this part of the world. So you've heard from several faculty members. Dr. Kent had his first field project
Coming out through you.
in Guatemala City. And so I see huge possibilities for everyone to be able to collaborate and to kind of grow a generation of students.
We
who will
can
go on
talk. I've already
do
thought of
these
3
things.
projects while I was sitting.
Good.
So,
Yeah.
If we can get a student who's interested in the archaeology part of it, I'd be willing to work with it.
I think it would be fantastic. I mean, we have a project that's ready to go to kind of give students valuable experience they can then take on to graduate school. There's a lot of work to be done in this area.
Yeah, it's a great problem. Barb's right. I mean, this has been going on for a while, and
Oh, it has, yeah.
this debate, and just looking at the map you got up there, the language map,
Yeah.
where they're distributed. There's all kinds of talk about trade networks going around the Yucatan Peninsula and stuff like that. And the interesting thing about that map that you showed is that you have the Cholan languages in the west and then Chorti over in the east. And, okay, they're connected. Why the space? And there are several possibilities, of course. It could be a substrate that was common to the whole region, one very good possibility. It could be a migrant population, you don't know until you do the archaeology. So there's lots of really good possible ways of getting at these things.
And the linguists are working on those very possibilities as well, and there are chapters in this book, if anybody, the edited volume, that address those issues on a lot more technical detail than we have.
No, it's a great problem.
Just one more thing, are you guys familiar with Mayans or ancient Mayan?
What is that?
It's an indigenous group in Guatemala that is fostering language regeneration. And I don't know if they're specifically targeting any particular dialect or version of Maya, but it's generally speaking just trying to revive the Maya language. And they're Mayan people teaching other Mayan people their language.
And they're focused on reading lists, I think.
And they have a Facebook page, so.
Yeah, that's probably happening in the mountains.
Go ahead, David.
Two things. One, where's your funding coming from for, at least you just pulling it together in different projects?
Piecemeal.
Yeah, not much funding.
And the other thing is like the museum, is there, where's the museum hook in this?
The museum hook, there are plans to build a museum in Hocotan that is focused on local culture. Robin's saying, don't forget the language as well. It may not be a permanently opened museum, but it might be a museum that's only open when people come to visit. But they have the land has been donated. The foundations for the museum are there because it was actually a concrete pad for drying coffee originally. This is part of this kind of political, trust issue. It's being donated by a Ladino family who have been large landowners in the area for generations, very high up in the political infrastructure within the town. And so they're trying to work alongside the activists and the language educators, and so there's a interesting trust building projects there. When we were there, they mentioned trying to bring in tourists because Hocotan's on the highway from Guatemala City to Copan. And so initially they were trying to figure out ways to flag down the tourist buses to get them to stop at the museum. But then when we were there, they were talking about bringing individuals in, tour groups in from Copan for day trips as well. So this language tour would be kind of a nice template for that kind of thing. And talk emerged during the workshop of opening a second museum, linked museums, one in Copan and one in Hocotan, to try and bring people in and try and share resources, I suppose, and try and kind of cash in on some of the Western backpackers that make it to Copan and some of the expats who are living there now. So the goal is to try and figure out ways to do this, to bring dollars into the local community without having the kinds of negative impacts that you would have with large-scale mass tourism.
There's an airport that just opened in Copan.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Copan it's well laid out to take in outsiders and tourists and students on field schools and things like this.
Yeah, Copan's pretty
Restaurants, et cetera.
Yeah, Copan's pretty nice.
Yeah. So, Dr. Metz, I think, is the primary person with the museum project at this point. He has been working closely with the individuals, Jorge Nolasco being one of them in town, and they have written up kind of a first version proposal. And so they're trying to flesh that out at this point, and eventually there will be calls for help, student labor, funding, et cetera. And we're hoping that we'll be in a position to help lend a hand to those efforts.
know, something for my students to do too.
Yes.
And
So we definitely encourage students who are interested to think about the field school. Through KU, the credits are transferable back to Metro. It would be a great opportunity.
Well,
Thank
thank you so much for
having a
coming.
great
Fancy certificates for your great work. And there's also one for the ethnography lab, okay, for all your great work, and also Dr. Forgash. Thank you very much.